April 25th, 1915. Dawn broke over the Gallipoli Peninsula. British, Australian, New Zealand, and French troops climbed out of landing boats and waded toward the beaches of Turkey. They expected light resistance. What they found was hell. Turkish machine guns opened fire from the cliffs above. Bullets tore through the water. Men fell before they reached the sand. Those who made it to the beach were pinned down. No cover, no escape, no chance. By nightfall, thousands were dead. Back in London, one man bore the weight of every death: Winston Churchill. At 40 years old, he was First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. One of the youngest men ever to hold such power. He was brilliant, ambitious, arrogant, and he had promised this invasion would end the war. Instead, it became the greatest military disaster in British history. Over 100,000 Allied casualties. Entire generations of young Australian and New Zealand men wiped out. Churchill was vilified, destroyed, forced to resign in disgrace. Churchill the Butcher, the newspapers called him. His political career was over. But here's what history books often miss. Gallipoli didn't destroy Winston Churchill. It created him. The man who would save Britain in 1940 was forged in the fires of failure in 1915. This is the story of Churchill's greatest disaster, and how the lessons learned in blood on Turkish beaches would later save Western civilization. To understand Gallipoli, you need to understand the Winston Churchill of 1914. Young, fearless, absolutely convinced of his own brilliance. Winston had always been special, or so he told himself. Born into aristocracy, grandson of a duke, son of a famous politician. But his father despised him, called him stupid, predicted he'd disgrace the family. Young Winston responded by becoming extraordinary. War correspondent in Cuba at 21, captured in the Boer War, escaped from prison, became an international celebrity at 25. Member of Parliament at 26, cabinet minister at 33, First Lord of the Admiralty at 37. Meteoric didn't begin to describe it. Churchill loved war, genuinely loved it. Not the death, but the clarity, the purpose, the chance to prove himself. Nothing in life is so exhilarating as to be shot at without result, he once wrote. He'd been shot at plenty, charged with cavalry in Sudan, dodged bullets in South Africa. But as First Lord of the Admiralty, he wouldn't be fighting this war. He'd be planning it. And Churchill had a plan that would change everything. August 1914. World War I erupted. Within weeks, the Western Front had become a nightmare of trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns. Millions of men dug into the mud from Belgium to Switzerland. Neither side could advance. Every attack was slaughter. Britain's generals kept throwing men at German machine guns. Thousands died for yards of worthless ground. Churchill watched in horror. "This is insanity," he told anyone who'd listen. "We need a new strategy." Then he looked at a map. If the Western Front was deadlocked, what about attacking somewhere else? Turkey had just entered the war on Germany's side. The Ottoman Empire controlled the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. If Britain could force that strait, they could. Reach Russia through the Black Sea, knock Turkey out of the war, threaten Germany from the south end. The stalemate Churchill became obsessed. He presented his plan to the War Cabinet with absolute conviction. A bold naval assault. Force the Dardanelles with battleships. Shell Constantinople into submission. Turkey surrenders. War over by Christmas. The admirals were skeptical. The generals were lukewarm. But Churchill was magnetic, passionate, utterly convincing. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith gave approval. Churchill had his chance to win the war. What Churchill didn't know, what his confidence blinded him to, was that he was about to make every mistake a leader can make, and thousands of young men would pay the price. February 1915. The Royal Navy began the assault on the Dardanelles. Churchill's plan was simple. Battleships would blast through Turkish defenses, sweep aside mines, and sail to Constantinople. No large-scale infantry needed, just naval power. The first attacks went well. British battleships bombarded Turkish forts. Some were destroyed. Churchill was ecstatic. "See," he told doubters, "it's working." But he'd made his first critical mistake. He'd telegraphed his intentions. The Turks knew exactly where the attack was coming. They had weeks to prepare. And prepare they did. March 18th, 1915. The main naval assault. 16 Allied battleships entered the Dardanelles Strait. What Churchill didn't know, the Turks had laid hundreds of additional mines, had positioned mobile howitzers on the cliffs, had turned the strait into a death trap. HMS Irresistible hit a mine, sank. HMS Ocean hit a mine, sank. HMS Bouvet, a French battleship, hit a mine and capsized in 90 seconds. 600 men drowned. Within hours, 1/3 of the attacking fleet was destroyed or crippled. The naval assault was a disaster. Churchill's response? Double down. "We were so close," he insisted. "One more push and we break through." But the Admiralty had lost its nerve. No more battleships. So Churchill pivoted to Plan B, a land invasion. Troops would storm the Gallipoli Peninsula, capture the high ground, and silence the Turkish guns. Then the Navy could pass through. Here's where Churchill made his second catastrophic mistake. He rushed. Military invasions require planning, reconnaissance, intelligence. Churchill gave the commanders weeks when they needed months. Nobody knew the terrain. Nobody knew Turkish troop strength. Nobody had accurate maps. But Churchill was impatient, convinced that delay meant defeat. "Attack," he urged, "before the Turks can reinforce." April 25, 1915, 75,000 Allied troops hit the beaches and walked into a nightmare. Turkish commander Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, had positioned his troops brilliantly. Machine guns on every cliff, artillery zeroed on every beach, clear fields of fire. The Anzacs, Australian and New Zealand troops, landed at the wrong beach, found themselves trapped beneath 300-foot cliffs. British troops at Cape Helles were slaughtered before they left the boats. French colonial troops suffered devastating casualties. By the end of the first day, 20,000 Allied casualties, for virtually no ground gained. But Churchill, back in London, still believed. "Hold on," he wired. "Reinforcements coming." Months dragged on. Summer in Gallipoli meant dysentery, flies, and 100-degree heat. Soldiers died from disease as much as bullets. Every attack failed. Every position became a death trap. Back in London, the newspapers turned on Churchill. "Architect of disaster. Butcher of the Dardanelles. Blood on his hands." Political enemies circled. His own party abandoned him. In May 1915, a new coalition government formed. Churchill was stripped of the Admiralty, given a meaningless position, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. A humiliation, a prison without bars. Churchill fell into the darkest depression of his life. The Black Dog, he called it. He'd staked everything on Gallipoli, his judgment, his career, his legacy, and he'd failed catastrophically. Young men, barely 20 years old, had died because of his arrogance. Their mothers' letters haunted him, their faces in the newspapers. In November 1915, Churchill resigned from government entirely. At 41, his political career appeared finished. He requested a commission in the army and went to fight on the Western Front. Not as a general, as a lieutenant colonel commanding a battalion. From the heights of power to the mud of Flanders. Most men would have broken completely. Churchill was about to learn the lessons that would define his life. January 1916. Lieutenant Colonel Winston Churchill arrived at the Western Front. He commanded the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers, a battalion that had been shattered in earlier fighting. The men expected some pompous politician playing soldier. What they got shocked them. Churchill shared the trenches, ate the same rations, endured the same mud, lice, and artillery barrages. When shells fell, he didn't hide. He inspected positions under fire. When soldiers were killed, he wrote personally to their families. One officer later wrote, "We expected a fool. Instead, we got a leader who cared more about our lives than his own reputation." Churchill was learning something he'd never understood from the luxury of the Admiralty. The weight of command isn't measured in strategy, it's measured in lives. Every order he gave at Gallipoli from his London office had meant real men, with mothers, wives, children, dying on distant beaches. Now he saw war from the bottom, and it changed him forever. Churchill spent 6 months at the front, then returned to Parliament, still disgraced, still blamed for Gallipoli. But something in him had shifted. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something deeper, humility born from failure. Over the next 2 decades, Churchill would study Gallipoli obsessively. What went wrong? Where did he fail? He identified every mistake. 1. Overconfidence in untested plans. He'd assumed the Turks would collapse easily, never considered they'd fight brilliantly. Lesson learned. Never underestimate your enemy. 2. Ignoring expert advice. Admirals had warned the strait was too dangerous. He dismissed them. Lesson learned. Listen to people with experience, even when it contradicts your vision. 3. Rushing without proper preparation. He'd forced the invasion before troops were ready, before intelligence was gathered. Lesson learned. Speed without preparation is recklessness. 4. Doubling down on failure. When the naval attack failed, he should have stopped. Instead, he escalated. Lesson learned. Know when to cut your losses. 5. Underestimating the human cost he'd thought in terms of strategy, not in terms of mothers' sons. Lesson learned. Never forget that orders mean lives. These lessons, bought with the blood of 100,000 men, would save Britain 25 years later, May 1940. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister just as Nazi Germany invaded France. Britain faced its darkest hour, and Churchill, older, scarred by failure, humbled by Gallipoli, made decisions that were the opposite of everything he'd done in 1915. When generals proposed risky operations, he demanded proof. No more Gallipolis. Show me the intelligence. Show me the preparation. When evacuation at Dunkirk seemed impossible, he listened to Navy officers. They said civilian boats could help. Churchill, remembering his failure to trust experts, approved immediately. 338,000 men were saved. When advisors pushed him to make peace with Hitler, he refused. But not out of arrogance, out of calculated conviction. He knew, because Gallipoli had taught him, that some fights, no matter how costly, must be fought. There's a moment in 1940 that captures everything. After Dunkirk, Churchill addressed Parliament. He could have boasted, could have promised easy victory. Instead, he said, "Wars are not won by evacuations." Then he warned of the brutal fight ahead. The old Churchill, the Churchill of 1915, would have promised a quick victory. The new Churchill, forged in Gallipoli's fires, told the truth, and Britain trusted him because of it. In 1941, as First Lord of the Admiralty again, he'd returned to the post in 1939, Churchill planned Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. Every detail was scrutinized, every risk assessed, every contingency planned. His staff noticed Churchill was obsessed with amphibious operations. One admiral asked why. Churchill's response was simple. "I will never again send men onto beaches without knowing they have every possible chance of success." Gallipoli had taught him, and D-Day, June 6, 1944, proved he'd learned. The most complex amphibious operation in history. Months of planning, meticulous preparation, careful deception. It succeeded because Churchill insisted on doing everything Gallipoli taught him to do. After the war, someone asked Churchill if he regretted Gallipoli. He thought for a long moment. "I regret every life lost," he said quietly, "but I don't regret the lessons, because those lessons saved Britain." Winston Churchill died in 1965. His state funeral was the largest Britain had ever seen, but perhaps the most moving tribute came from an unexpected place, Turkey. The nation Churchill had attacked in 1915 honored him as one of history's great leaders. Why? Because Ataturk, the Turkish commander at Gallipoli, had also learned from that battle. He went on to found modern Turkey, and he respected Churchill for having the courage to attempt the impossible. Gallipoli teaches us something profound about leadership. Your greatest failures, if you learn from them, become your greatest strengths. Churchill could have let Gallipoli destroy him. Instead, he let it forge him. The arrogant young man who planned Gallipoli would never have saved Britain in 1940. That man was too confident, too certain, too unwilling to listen. But the humbled veteran who returned from the trenches, who'd learned to value lives over glory, who'd learned to trust experts, who'd learned that some defeats must be accepted and some fights must be fought. That man could save the world. There's a memorial at Gallipoli today. Ataturk himself wrote the inscription for the Anzac Memorial. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives. You are now lying in the soil of a friendly country, therefore rest in peace. Churchill visited once, decades later. He stood silently at the graves. Someone asked what he was thinking. "I'm remembering the price of my education," he said softly. Leadership isn't about never failing. It's about what failure teaches you. Churchill's catastrophe at Gallipoli taught him humility, caution, the value of human life, the importance of preparation, when to fight and when to withdraw. Without Gallipoli, there's no Churchill of 1940. Without failure, there's no wisdom. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. A promise made by a man who knew their cost. Never, never, never give up. Words from a man who had every reason to quit.